In the autumn of 1903, a traveling merchant named Ezekiel Thornton arrived in the remote settlement of Millfield, Utah, carrying with him a peculiar commission. The local postmaster had contacted him months earlier, requesting that he deliver a sealed envelope to the territorial authorities in Salt Lake City. What made this request extraordinary was not the distance. Thornton regularly traversed the harsh Utah wilderness, but rather the postmaster's insistence that the envelope remain unopened until it reached the desk of Marshal William Garrett, and the curious fact that payment for this service had been made not in coin, but in a small vial of what appeared to be crystalline powder, carefully wrapped in brown paper and accompanied by detailed instructions for its identification. The envelope, when finally opened 3 weeks later in Marshal Garrett's office, contained a single sheet of paper bearing the shaking handwriting of Dr. Samuel Morrison, the only licensed physician serving the scattered Mormon settlements in that remote corner of the territory. Morrison's message was brief but disturbing. 7 members of the Prescott family died within hours of their evening meal on October 15th. The symptoms and circumstances suggest deliberate poisoning. Request immediate investigation before burial proceeds. Evidence preserved. What Dr. Morrison had not mentioned in his hastily written note, but what would become apparent during the subsequent investigation, was that the deceased included 3 children under the age of 10, and that the sole survivor of the evening's events was 19-year-old Miriam Prescott, the youngest wife of the family's patriarch, Josiah Prescott, who had taken his final breath while clutching a piece of cornbread that would later test positive for a concentration of strychnine sufficient to kill a horse. The Prescott family compound sat in a valley 23 miles from the nearest neighboring homestead, accessible only by a narrow dirt trail that wound through towering red sandstone formations and across 2 seasonal creek beds that rendered the location virtually unreachable during winter months. Josiah Prescott had established this isolated settlement in 1887, bringing with him his first wife, Martha, and their 4 children, along with sufficient livestock and farming equipment to create a self-sustaining agricultural operation. The compound consisted of a main dwelling constructed from local sandstone and timber, a smaller residence that housed Prescott's second wife, Rebecca, and her 3 children, and various outbuildings including a large barn, a grain storage facility, and a workshop where Josiah crafted the furniture and agricultural tools necessary for their isolated existence. The property encompassed nearly 400 acres of arable land, irrigated by an ingenious system of channels and reservoirs that Josiah had designed and constructed himself, demonstrating the mechanical aptitude and determination that had allowed him to create prosperity in this remote wilderness. The practice of plural marriage, while officially discontinued by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1890, continued in isolated communities throughout the Utah Territory, where enforcement of federal anti-polygamy laws proved difficult and where traditional religious beliefs remained deeply entrenched. Josiah Prescott's household represented a typical arrangement for such communities. His first wife, Martha, served as the primary matriarch and household manager, while his second wife, Rebecca, assumed responsibility for textile production and food preservation. When 19-year-old Miriam Caldwell became Prescott's 3rd wife in the spring of 1902, she entered a carefully structured domestic hierarchy where her youth and inexperience relegated her to the most basic household tasks under the supervision of the elder wives. This arrangement, while common in polygamous households, created complex emotional dynamics and potential sources of resentment that outside observers would later identify as significant factors in understanding the events of October 15, 1903. Miriam Caldwell's background prior to her marriage provided crucial context for the subsequent tragedy. Born in 1884 to a family of recent converts to Mormonism, she had spent her early childhood in the industrial city of Pittsburgh before her parents joined a wagon train bound for Utah in 1891. The Caldwell family settled initially in Salt Lake City, where Miriam's father, Thomas, found employment in the copper mines, while her mother, Sarah, took in laundry to supplement their meager income. However, Thomas Caldwell's growing involvement with fundamentalist Mormon sects that continued to practice plural marriage led to increasing conflicts with mainstream church authorities, ultimately resulting in the family's relocation to the remote settlements where such practices could continue without interference. When Miriam turned 18, her father arranged her marriage to Josiah Prescott, a man 34 years her senior, in exchange for a substantial dowry payment and the promise of financial support for the Caldwell family during difficult times. The circumstances surrounding Miriam's integration into the Prescott household revealed significant tensions that would prove relevant to later events. Martha Prescott, at 43 years of age, had spent 16 years as Josiah's only wife before the arrival of Rebecca in 1899, and she had initially welcomed the addition of a second wife as relief from the demanding responsibilities of managing such an extensive household. However, Miriam's arrival disrupted the established equilibrium between Martha and Rebecca, particularly because Josiah's obvious fascination with his young bride led to her receiving preferential treatment in matters of clothing, jewelry, and personal attention. Martha's diary, discovered during the investigation, contained numerous entries expressing frustration with Miriam's prideful ways and her apparent inability to perform even simple domestic tasks without constant supervision and correction. The isolation of the Prescott compound meant that social interactions outside the family unit were extremely limited, with visits from neighboring families occurring only 2 or 3 times per year, and contact with the outside world dependent upon Josiah's quarterly trips to the nearest town for supplies and business transactions. This isolation intensified the emotional pressures within the household, particularly for Miriam, who had grown up in urban environments and struggled to adapt to the demanding physical labor and strict religious observances that governed daily life in the compound. Dr. Morrison's medical records, maintained meticulously despite the remote location of his practice, documented several visits to treat Miriam for what he described as nervous exhaustion and melancholic episodes, conditions that he attributed to the challenges of adjustment to married life and the harsh realities of frontier existence. The events of October 15, 1903, began with what appeared to be a routine evening meal, prepared according to the careful schedule that governed all activities within the Prescott household. Martha Prescott, as head cook, had spent the afternoon preparing a substantial supper featuring fresh bread, preserved vegetables from the family's gardens, milk from their dairy cows, and roasted chicken from their extensive poultry operation. The meal was served in the main dining room of the primary residence, with all family members present, except for the youngest child, 2-year-old Samuel, who was recovering from a minor illness and remained in his bed under Rebecca's care. The seating arrangement followed established protocol: Josiah at the head of the table, Martha to his right, Rebecca to his left, and the remaining children arranged by age, with Miriam occupying the position at the foot of the table, traditionally reserved for the youngest wife. Contemporary accounts of the meal, reconstructed from the testimony of Dr. Morrison and the physical evidence discovered at the scene, indicated that the family consumed their supper in the customary manner, beginning with a lengthy prayer offered by Josiah and proceeding through several courses while maintaining the respectful quiet that characterized their religious observances. Miriam, according to the subsequent investigation, ate sparingly and appeared distracted throughout the meal, behavior that Martha later described as typical of her sister wife's recent demeanor. The first signs of distress appeared approximately 30 minutes after the family had finished eating, when 8-year-old Joseph Prescott complained of severe stomach pain and began vomiting violently. Within minutes, similar symptoms manifested in the other family members, with the exception of Miriam, who remained unaffected as the situation rapidly deteriorated into a horrific scene of mass poisoning. The progression of symptoms that followed matched precisely the clinical presentation of strychnine poisoning, a fact that Dr. Morrison recognized immediately upon his arrival at the compound the following morning. Strychnine, derived from the seeds of the Strychnos nux vomica tree, and readily available during this period as a common pesticide for rodent control, produces a characteristic pattern of violent muscle spasms, respiratory distress, and ultimately death by asphyxiation. The victims experienced increasingly severe convulsions, during which their bodies arched backward in the distinctive opisthatonic posture typical of strychnine poisoning, while maintaining complete mental clarity until the final moments of their lives. This particular aspect of strychnine poisoning, the preservation of consciousness during the dying process, made the deaths particularly horrific for both the victims and for Miriam, who witnessed the entire ordeal while remaining mysteriously unaffected by the poison that had contaminated their shared meal. Dr. Morrison's examination of the scene revealed crucial evidence that would guide the subsequent investigation. The family members had died in various locations throughout the house, indicating that they had attempted to seek help or comfort during their final minutes. But the distribution of the bodies provided important clues about the timing and progression of the poisoning. Josiah Prescott was found in the kitchen, apparently having attempted to reach the water pump, while Martha died in the main bedroom, suggesting that she had tried to reach her medication chest. The children were found clustered around Rebecca, who appeared to have gathered them together in a desperate attempt to provide comfort during their final moments. Most significantly, Dr. Morrison noted that the kitchen table still contained the remains of the evening meal, including several pieces of cornbread that showed visible signs of contamination when examined under magnification. The subsequent investigation focused intensively on the source and method of the strychnine contamination, with particular attention paid to the preparation and serving of the cornbread that appeared to be the primary vehicle for the poison. Martha Prescott had prepared the bread using her standard recipe, which called for cornmeal ground from corn grown on the family's property, wheat flour purchased during Josiah's most recent supply trip, milk from their dairy herd, eggs from their chickens, and salt from their stores. The preparation process, according to Miriam's testimony, had followed Martha's usual routine, with the bread mixed and baked in the afternoon and served warm with the evening meal. However, careful examination of the bread samples revealed that the strychnine contamination was not evenly distributed throughout the loaves, but rather concentrated in specific areas, suggesting that the poison had been added after the initial mixing process, possibly during the final preparation or serving stages. The question of access to strychnine proved crucial to understanding how the poisoning had occurred. Josiah Prescott maintained supplies of various chemicals for agricultural and pest control purposes, including strychnine powder used to eliminate the ground squirrels that threatened their grain stores. These chemicals were stored in a locked cabinet in the workshop, with Josiah maintaining strict control over access due to their dangerous nature. However, the investigation revealed that Martha Prescott also possessed a small quantity of strychnine powder, which she used in much smaller doses to control rodent problems in the main residence's food storage areas. This supply was kept in a small tin container in the kitchen pantry, readily accessible to any household member during food preparation activities. Miriam's behavior during and after the poisoning incident became a central focus of the investigation, particularly her apparent immunity to the toxin that killed 7 other family members who had shared the same meal. Her testimony, recorded by Marshall Garrett during multiple interviews, revealed significant inconsistencies and gaps that raised questions about her truthfulness and potential involvement in the deaths. She claimed to have eaten the same food as the rest of the family, including the contaminated cornbread, but could not explain why she alone remained unaffected. When pressed about her activities during the meal preparation, she provided conflicting accounts of her role in the kitchen, first stating that she had helped Martha with the cooking, then claiming that she had been excluded from food preparation duties as punishment for a previous domestic mishap. The physical evidence discovered during the investigation painted a disturbing picture of premeditation and careful planning. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in Miriam's sleeping area, investigators found a small leather pouch containing approximately 1 ounce of strychnine powder, wrapped in cloth and accompanied by a hand-drawn diagram showing the layout of the dining table with specific notations indicating seating positions. More significantly, they discovered a partially burned letter addressed to Miriam from her father, Thomas Caldwell, in which he expressed his dissatisfaction with reports of her treatment by the Prescott family and suggested that desperate circumstances sometimes require desperate measures to achieve freedom. The letter also contained detailed instructions for obtaining and administering strychnine, including dosage calculations and methods for concealing the bitter taste that might otherwise alert potential victims. The timeline of events on October 15th became clearer as investigators pieced together additional evidence from the scene and from Miriam's increasingly contradictory statements. The cornbread had been prepared in 2 batches, with the first batch consumed by the family during their midday meal without incident. The second batch, baked specifically for the evening supper, was the source of the contamination, suggesting that the strychnine had been added during the afternoon preparation period when Miriam was known to have spent considerable time alone in the kitchen. Physical examination of the bread revealed that the poison had been mixed into the butter that was spread on individual pieces before serving, a method that would have allowed for selective contamination of specific portions while leaving others untainted. The motive for the poisoning emerged through careful reconstruction of the increasingly desperate circumstances that had surrounded Miriam's life in the months preceding the tragedy. Letters discovered in her possession revealed her growing desperation to escape the isolation and demands of plural marriage, particularly as winter approached and the family would be completely cut off from outside contact for several months. Her correspondence with family members in Salt Lake City indicated that she had repeatedly requested permission to visit her parents, only to be denied by Josiah, who believed that such trips would expose her to corrupting influences that might undermine her commitment to their religious lifestyle. The arrival of autumn, with its promise of months of enforced isolation with people who increasingly viewed her as a burden and source of disruption, appeared to have precipitated her decision to take drastic action. The investigation also revealed evidence of Miriam's attempts to establish an alibi for the poisoning, including her deliberate efforts to be seen eating the contaminated food and her theatrical displays of grief and horror when the other family members began showing symptoms of poisoning. Witnesses who arrived at the compound the following day reported that Miriam's emotional responses seemed calculated rather than genuine, with periods of intense weeping alternating with moments of unusual calm and composure. Her repeated insistence that she could not understand why she alone had survived, combined with her detailed knowledge of the symptoms and progression of strychnine poisoning, suggested a level of preparation and premeditation that contradicted her claims of innocence. The legal proceedings that followed the investigation were complicated by the remote location of the crime and the unique social and religious circumstances of the polygamous household. Territorial authorities struggled with questions of jurisdiction and evidence, particularly given the limited forensic capabilities available in 1903 and the challenges of proving premeditated murder in a case where the defendant claimed to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. Miriam's youth and apparent vulnerability as a plural wife in an isolated household generated sympathy among some observers who viewed her as a victim of religious extremism and patriarchal oppression rather than a calculating murderer. However, the physical evidence and the systematic nature of the poisoning ultimately supported charges of multiple counts of first-degree murder. The trial, conducted in the territorial courthouse in Salt Lake City during the winter of 1904, attracted national attention as one of the first major criminal cases to emerge from the polygamous communities that continued to operate in defiance of federal law. Newspaper coverage focused intensively on the exotic details of plural marriage and the isolated lifestyle of the Prescott compound, often at the expense of careful examination of the evidence in legal proceedings. Defense attorneys attempted to portray Miriam as a victim of psychological abuse and religious coercion, arguing that her actions, if proven, resulted from mental deterioration caused by the trauma of forced marriage and social isolation. The prosecution, however, presented compelling evidence of premeditation and careful planning that contradicted claims of diminished capacity or temporary insanity. The testimony of Dr. Morrison proved crucial to the prosecution's case, as his medical expertise and familiarity with the Prescott family provided authoritative analysis of both the physical evidence and the psychological factors that might have motivated the poisoning. His detailed documentation of Miriam's previous medical visits revealed a pattern of calculation and manipulation that contradicted the defense portrayal of an innocent victim driven to desperation. Morrison's analysis of the strychnine contamination demonstrated that the poisoning required considerable knowledge of dosages and effects, suggesting that Miriam had conducted extensive research and planning before implementing her deadly scheme. His testimony regarding the specific symptoms and progression of strychnine poisoning effectively countered defense arguments that the deaths might have resulted from accidental contamination or environmental factors. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty on 7 counts of murder in the first degree, rejecting defense arguments regarding diminished capacity and accepting the prosecution's evidence of premeditated poisoning. The verdict reflected not only the strength of the physical evidence, but also the jury's conclusion that Miriam's systematic approach to the poisoning demonstrated clear intent and awareness of the consequences of her actions. The judge's sentencing remarks emphasized the particularly heinous nature of the crime, noting that the murder of an entire family, including young children, represented an act of such calculated cruelty that it demanded the ultimate penalty available under territorial law. The execution of Miriam Prescott took place on June 12, 1905, at the Utah Territorial Prison, making her one of the youngest women ever executed in the American West. Her final statement, delivered from the gallows, maintained her innocence, while expressing remorse for the deaths of the family members, a contradiction that left observers debating her true mental state and the justice of her punishment. The case established important precedents for the investigation and prosecution of poisoning cases in the American legal system, particularly regarding the use of medical testimony and physical evidence in proving premeditation and intent. The abandoned Prescott compound remained untouched for several years following the tragedy, as local authorities struggled with questions of property ownership and inheritance in the absence of surviving family members. The isolation that had once provided protection for the polygamous household now contributed to its complete abandonment, as neighboring families viewed the location as cursed and avoided any contact with the scene of such horrific deaths. When territorial surveyors finally visited the property in 1908, they found that scavengers and weather had damaged most of the structures, but the main residence remained largely intact, preserving the dining room where the poisoned meal had been consumed and the kitchen where Miriam had prepared her deadly concoction. The legacy of the Prescott poisoning case extended far beyond its immediate legal and social consequences, influencing both criminal investigation procedures and public attitudes toward polygamous communities in the American West. Law enforcement agencies began developing more sophisticated approaches to poisoning investigations, including improved methods for detecting and analyzing toxic substances and better coordination between local and territorial authorities in complex cases. The case also contributed to growing federal pressure on Utah Territory to more aggressively prosecute polygamy and related criminal activities, ultimately influencing the territory's path towards statehood and the complete elimination of plural marriage practices. Modern forensic analysis of the preserved evidence from the Prescott case has confirmed the accuracy of Dr. Morrison's original conclusions regarding the source and method of the strychnine poisoning, while also revealing additional details about the sophisticated planning that preceded the murders. Advanced chemical testing has identified trace amounts of other substances mixed with the strychnine, suggesting that Miriam had experimented with various compounds to mask the characteristic bitter taste of the poison and increase its effectiveness. The discovery of these additional substances supports contemporary conclusions regarding the premeditated nature of the crime, while raising new questions about the extent of Miriam's chemical knowledge and the sources of her information about toxic substances. The psychological profile of Miriam Prescott that emerges from careful examination of the case evidence reveals a complex individual whose actions resulted from a combination of personal desperation, social constraints, and calculated planning, rather than simple victimization or mental illness. Her ability to maintain normal relationships and perform complex domestic tasks up until the time of the poisoning contradicts theories of severe psychological impairment, while her systematic approach to the murders demonstrates rational planning and awareness of consequences. The case illustrates the dangerous potential that exists when social isolation, religious extremism, and personal desperation combine with access to deadly substances and the knowledge necessary to employ them effectively. The broader implications of the Prescott poisoning case for understanding domestic violence and family murder in isolated religious communities continue to resonate in contemporary criminal justice research. The pattern of escalating tension, systematic planning, and devastating execution that characterized Miriam's actions has been identified in numerous similar cases involving family annihilation, particularly in situations where social isolation and religious or cultural constraints limit options for escape or resolution of domestic conflicts. The case serves as a reminder that even the most apparently vulnerable individuals can become capable of extraordinary violence when circumstances align with opportunity and desperate motivation. The physical remnants of the Prescott compound were finally demolished in 1923 when the land was purchased by the state of Utah for incorporation into a wildlife preserve. However, the foundations of the main residence remain visible to trained observers, And archaeological investigations conducted in the 1990s recovered numerous artifacts related to the family's daily life and the events of October 15, 1903. These artifacts, including fragments of the poisoned cornbread preserved in the dry climate, now reside in the collections of the Utah State Historical Society, where they serve as tangible reminders of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in the territory's history. The story of Miriam Prescott and the poisoning of the Prescott family continues to fascinate researchers and true crime enthusiasts more than a century after the events occurred, not merely because of its shocking violence, but because of the complex social, religious, and psychological factors that contributed to such a devastating outcome. The case illustrates how isolation, desperation, and access to deadly means can combine to produce unthinkable tragedies, while also demonstrating the importance of thorough criminal investigation and the pursuit of justice even in the most challenging circumstances. The careful preservation of evidence and the meticulous documentation maintained by Dr. Morrison and other contemporary investigators provide a window into both the crime itself and the social conditions that made such violence possible, ensuring that the lessons of this tragedy remain available to inform our understanding of domestic violence and family murder in extreme circumstances.